Hello and welcome to the Fire in the Belly show. Today we'll have myself, Mighty Pete, and we are joined by the Doug Garland. So good afternoon, first of all, Doug. Great to see you here. Great to have you on.
My pleasure, Pete. I'm happy to be on.
Oh, listen, it's great. So to give our listeners a bit of background, so Doug Garland, MD, practiced orthopedic surgery for 37 years in Southern California. Dr. Garland was a clinical professor of orthopedics at the University of Southern California, where he authored over 100 peer-reviewed scientific articles. With over 600 citations, The Tall Poppy Syndrome is the most comprehensive book on the subject. And we just had really a beautiful conversation even before we started here about the tall poppy, how it's a little bit of a foreign thing in America, but here in Europe, it is fairly well recognized. So first of all, Doug, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on, and tell us, what is the tall poppy all about?
The tall poppy syndrome is a metaphor, and you look at a field of poppies and you see a poppy taller than the others, and there's a tendency, a human natural tendency to want to cut that tall poppy down so that all are equal. And it's in most countries. It's a cultural phenomenon. Every country's a little different. Most of them have their own terms or words for them. For example, the Dutch say the tall tree catches the wind. The Japanese say the protruding nail gets pounded down. And of course, the Scandinavian or Nordic countries have what they call the law of Jante, G-A-N-T-E, and it's actually 10 commandments of how not to grow tall. So that it's really in their country to be humble people and not to outshine somebody else. So it's everywhere, except America. So my own experience is I grew up in a very small farm town in central Iowa. And I went to an all-boy school in Des Moines, Iowa. And I didn't appreciate it at the time, but my town was smaller than the high school. And I didn't know anybody, and everybody seemed smarter than myself. So I hitched my star to the smart kids in the class. And that was unbeknown to me, but that was good envy. Good envy is when you emulate somebody else. And that was a wonderful habit I picked up. And so that got me into college. That got me into medical school. When I was in medical school, I roomed with two of the smartest guys in the class. One was in the top 5 and the other was within the top 10. And I studied their habits. And of course, then that helped me get a residency, and that helped me get a fellowship. And then, of course, that helped me get, I belonged to one of the premier groups in Southern California in orthopedic surgery. But I also then worked at a rehabilitation center and ran various programs there to include premier programs in spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury. That then led to a lot of research and to a lot of appointment at the University of Southern California, and I eventually became a clinical professor there. So I had and mainly I had a private practice as well. So I was quite busy and had done very well for going to 20 million metropolitan area as a small boy from a town of 400 people. So by most people's view, I had done very well for where I started. And 30 years into my academic practice, I was chief of the spinal cord injury at that institution, and I had been the president of the American Spinal Injury Association. And at one time, I managed 100 beds of spinal cord injury patients. I was the chief of that service. And I was making arrangements to go to Australia to review their spinal cord injury units. I think they had 6, and I would visit each one for a week. And when I came back from a medical meeting, my office, I had a sign on my office that my office had been moved from the corner room with the big window down to a little cubby hole. And I went home and told my wife, and she had a little more emotional intelligence than I did because I was very bitter and angry and actually confused. And she said, "That's perfect. They don't want you anymore. You need to resign, and we'll enjoy the rest of our time in Los Angeles. We can take a day off and enjoy LA while everybody's working, and you can just work on your private practice." And I went in the next day, put my key on my desk, and walked out, called the people in Australia, and they said, "My goodness, you've been tall poppy." And I said, "What? I don't understand that." And they said, "You've been tall poppy." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And they said, "That means that you were taller than everybody else and they wanted to cut you down to size." And I said, "Well, the thing is, I've resigned my post and I'm not coming." So I never did get to Australia. But I finished out my professional career, then retired. And then while I had time in retirement, then I began to research the tall poppy syndrome because I never could figure out why I had been tall poppy and what the implications were and why was it known in America. So I did a year of research of, like you do any scientific study, of going to the library and looking up all the information. Most of the information on the tall poppy syndrome comes from Australia. And there is a lot of research in that area. So I spent time studying that and to understanding the Australian culture. The important thing to note about that culture is the country was founded as a penal colony. And as a penal colony for Britain, everybody was equal. And they maintain that to this day. They don't really have a lot of tall poppies. They're a little bit like the Nordic countries. They like to keep everybody about the same, and the government actually encourages that with their policies as well. And so in the research studies there, they emphasize the egalitarian aspects of the society, of everybody being equal, and there aren't, compared to America, for example, a lot of tall poppies. And in the studies, there were 2 reasons the people were cut down. The cutter had what we call, psychologists call, bad envy. So I mentioned that I at the time talked about good envy, which nobody talks about. And even our definition of envy is coveting somebody else's possessions, whether it's their home, their car, their wife, their good looks, their intelligence. You covet somebody else's aspects. And not only that, frequently the person that has those aspects, you want to destroy their happiness. So there's actually 2 parts to bad envy, but we don't call that bad envy. The Catholic Church calls it a sin. And we happen to think that's what envy is, but envy is really, by the psychologist standards, a functional state of being. And there's a good and a bad side to everything. But when we think about envy, we always think about the bad envy, and we don't really appreciate the good envy. So for your listeners, the first thing you have to know is there's 2 components to any emotion, or even what I call so-called sins to a certain extent. So the bad envy is part of what are known as the 7 deadly sins. And the other reason to cut people, and it's found in low self-esteem people. So the good envy would be if I'm in my neighborhood and I look across the street and see my neighbor's house or his car, and it's a little better than mine, then good envy would drive me to work a little harder, do a little overtime, do something else to improve myself so that I can be on that person's level. And bad envy, there's 2 components to the bad envy. One is the direct component, where if he had a nice car, I might slash the tires or scratch it. But the most common way is just to talk bad about that person to the rest of the neighbors and try and build myself up that I'm better than he is. So there's a direct and an indirect method to people's madness. And you have to understand that. Then the other main reason for cutting people down in Australia is egregious activity of the tall poppy, such that if they do have a sports figure and he behaves badly, then he should be cut down. That still is a judgment on the cutter, but they feel justified in cutting that tall poppy down. So in Australia, it's 2 main ways, and they really don't talk about the behavior of the cuttee, the person that was cut down so much. So that was my introduction. That was a year of research to understand that cultural aspect of Australia, and actually Ireland's a little like that, England's a little like that, and Canada's a little like that. But so the origin then of my formal research then, that was the background research. The question I needed to answer or wanted to answer was, is the tall poppy syndrome in America? And why is it unknown in America? So that led to my formal, what is called an observational study. I started taking the New York Times, the LA Times, Time magazines, periodicals to every day look in the paper to see, is tall poppy syndrome in America? And lo and behold, I found that the tall poppy syndrome was rampant in America. We just didn't know about it. It happened every day. And so in discussing this, the first thing that happened was when I related my story to a guy, I said, I've been cut down. And he said, well, how could you be cut down? Because I don't consider you to be a tall poppy. So that led to a real emergency in my research. How can this be like this? So in order to resolve that, I divided the tall poppy syndrome into what I call peer-to-peer and the public tall poppy syndrome. The peer-to-peer is the most rampant, and it happens within your own tribe, and you're not tall most of the time. That would be in your neighborhood, well, first in your family. So you have family envy. Almost every family is touched by that, usually bad envy. I actually had an older brother who I admired, and I emulated him. He was a really good brother, so I think that's what formed my habit then in high school, college, and medical school. So it's very, very good happening in my circumstance, but we did with 7 children in the family. We also had bad envy in the family as well. So that starts in the family. It starts when you go to school. Bullying is actually sort of an aspect of the tall poppy syndrome. It's in the workplace. I mean, that in America, where we have a meritocracy, it's can be very virile in the workplace as you try to climb the ladder of success. There's obstacles to that. So are you going to emulate somebody better yourself and move up, or are you going to try and cut that person down? And then, of course, we have the real tall poppies, which I call the public tall poppy syndrome. And those are true tall poppies. And in America, we have tons of tall poppies. So we have the media industry, we have Hollywood, we have sports, we have the business industries, and it's the public tall poppy that does egregious activities. And Australia, and most people don't talk about it, but they, in essence, really cut themselves down. So then I knew sort of what, from the Australian studies, what the cutters' emotions were, but I had to try and resolve why tall poppies got cut down. And the most common cause was hubris, or excessive pride. Pride in itself, once again, is it's one of the 7 deadly sins. And there's good and there's bad pride. So good pride, once again, is home ownership, and you have pride in your home and you maintain it. So that's helpful pride. Then you have the bad pride, which we call hubris, and almost all tall poppies fail because of hubris. Now, the other thing that's frequently attached to it is greed and lust. And then that brought me back to my Catholic roots of the 7 deadly sins. So most people have heard the term, but they don't really know what they are. So I'm teaching now people to think of the tall poppy syndrome, and you're going to know the 7 deadly sins. So in the cutter, you're going to have envy, which is the 7 deadly sin. It's bad envy. You're going to have anger, which is also divided into good and bad anger. Good anger really makes you focus on what caused you to become angry. Bad angry is, once again, going to probably harm the other person. But only 10% of bad anger ends in violence. So we always associate anger and violence, but it's not that common, the association. And the third part would be laziness. And so you're just too lazy to try and improve yourself. So that's 3 of the 7 deadly sins, 3 found in the cutter. And the cuttee, or the tall poppy, is pride, lust, and greed. So the only 7 deadly sin we've left out is gluttony. In Catholicism, for all the 7 deadly sins, or any sin, there's a virtue of how to counteract it. So one of the lessons for the listeners are, if you have bad envy, then figure out what the virtue is, and that's how you improve. So I still hadn't resolved the worldview of the tall poppy syndrome and other cultures. So then I started a second aspect of the research, was to look at countries worldwide and to look at time frames. So I started in ancient Greece. And ancient Greece actually described the tall poppy syndrome. They used fields of wheat instead of the poppy, but the metaphor was described in ancient Greece. And of course, Greece also had Socrates. Socrates drank the hemlock, which was really a form of the tall poppy syndrome. And so here's our very first early part of civilization, our first democracy, which America is very similar to. And here's the tall poppy syndrome, 3,000 years ago. So the early description was government related. It was the government, the head of one of the city states had conquered the next city. And the head sent his son to control the next city that they had just conquered. And the son wasn't doing a very good job. So he sent a messenger back to his dad to want to know how he was controlling people. Essentially good envy, but it's a bad reason, but he was trying to improve himself and figure out how to govern. And allegedly, he went out to a wheat field and he just knocked down the tall shocks of wheat. And the messenger went back and relayed that to his son, and he figured out it meant cut down the leaders in the city and you'll be able to control the city. From that episode, the original description, and Socrates, I learned that and Socrates was cut down by the city fathers in Athens. I learned that it was really driven by politics early on. So then I look at Rome, and of course, Rome has one of the best examples of Caesar crossing the Rubicon and coming back to Rome. And of course, that broke the law that you weren't supposed to bring troops back. And of course, Caesar's going to be literally and figuratively tall poppy. And Livy, who is the great historian of Rome, taught me another thing, which was all of the history of Rome was burnt during the sacking by the Greeks in 300 BC. There was very little left about the Roman history. And Livy knew what Aristotle knew was that men were emotionally the same. And Caesar, Alexander would have been the great if he was in Caesar's shoes at a different time period. So that the great leaders were going to be the same no matter what part of the world they were from and what part of time. So once I understood that concept, I felt that I could look through the world history and pick out world leaders and see the tall poppy syndrome and understand it in America as well. And that turned out to be true. Alexander the Great may or may not have been tall poppy, but his father was tall poppy. That's how Alexander got his job. Genghis Khan, the first emperor of China, tall poppied everybody that was too tall in order to gain rule. And Genghis Khan did the same thing. When Genghis Khan would conquer the next township, he would cut everybody down that was taller than the axle of his wagon, meaning that mostly adults, because they already had formed ideas, and he wanted people that just didn't have, he could formulate their ideas for them. And of course, Japan during the Shogun period did the same thing during the uniting of Japan. So I was able to look through most countries, and of course the isms, the communism, it's all about what I call Marxist envy. It's really about all people being equal and not having any land. And then you have the higher echelon that has everything, but all the other people are equal. So at that time, I felt I really understood the tall poppy syndrome. But in looking at the worldview, it was still controlled mostly by governments, which was the original description. And that became a huge part of looking then at America to see if tall poppy syndrome existed here. And of course, I figured out that I had to break it into two categories, the peer-to-peer versus the public, and get it to how the individual person could relate to the syndrome, and to the public syndrome, which is completely different than the peer-to-peer or private. And the emotions are going to be the same. It's going to be the 6 emotions. And then looking back, once I had changed my view from the Australian research, that when I looked at Australia and looked at it with my American view, that sure enough, my definition of the tall poppy syndrome held true when I looked back at cases in Australia. So I kind of reconciled my thinking to what I had visualized worldly and applied it to America. And I found it in every walk of life. I found it in every profession. I felt it in I mean, when you look at a lawyer, you're going to have, if you have a case, you have a win-loss situation. So there's going to be somebody win and somebody lose. Every case has 50-50. So you're at a 50-50 chance of somebody being tall poppied almost in every legal case that happens. So I felt the legal system had the biggest chance of the tall poppy syndrome, but all professions in the end. There's intense competition for patients if you're a physician, same with the dentist, so that the professional system, even the arts, which in Australia, they don't talk about artists having competition, but if you look in America, where our arts, especially after 50 became part of the art capital of the world, all those artists were very competitive and cut each other down. So even I feel the arts have tremendous examples of the tall poppy syndrome. So I then wrote the book with various chapters, including many of the things that we're talking about. And I devoted a chapter itself to the government itself, because I believe our government is a big cutter of the tall poppy syndrome, just as I mentioned the isms were. And I put a chapter in how to be a tall poppy. But at the conclusion of my book, I felt that the tall poppy syndrome was just unrecognized in America, but it may be more prevalent here than any other country because of our meritocracy and competition. I really feel that drives it, as much as being equal, everybody equal. I mean, clear back when Viktor Frankl wrote his book about the concentration camp, where everybody was equal, it would drive people crazy in the concentration camp if somebody had a toothbrush and then the next person didn't. So there's no doubt that equality drives it, but so does meritocracy. So I think it's present everywhere, and I think it's driven mostly by emotions, mainly the emotions I missed. And if you were to go ahead and read the literature in Australia, you wouldn't get that take on it, but that's my personal take. And the best way to understand it is to think more about emotionally. You know, Dan Goleman wrote a book in the 90s, which became very popular in America, Emotional Intelligence. And that book, he feels, and I actually agree with him, that emotional intelligence is more important than IQ intelligence. And I think if you keep that in mind and look at societies, you'll understand the world, you'll understand the national level, you'll understand your neighborhood. And I call that looking through the window. But the most important part of that is once you understand the emotional makeup of people and the world around you, if you then look in the mirror, you will understand your own emotional makeup.
What have you learned about yourself from this research?
Well, I learned that I was lucky. I think I just had a good family. I grew up in a good family, and I had strong parents, a strong religious belief, hard work ethic, and that was sort of natural to me. But I had no idea. I mean, I'm not going to argue what's the most important emotion. I mean, you can't go very far without love, but I really developed a new appreciation for envy and how lucky I was at not having my life controlled by bad envy, and that it was just a subconscious learned thing. When I was that was the luckiest thing in my life, and that's what I think the big message I would want people to think about, because envy is always on. I mean, the first thing when you and I turned on our electronic machine, we looked at each other and we subconsciously evaluated each other. And so envy is always on, and unfortunately, it's usually on negatively. And our social media has made that worse. And by that, I mean, you go out, good envy would be if you went to a restaurant and you took a photograph of your meal with all your friends. And the good envy would be if I sent that back to somebody and said, with the connotation would be, this is a really good restaurant. I want you to think about coming here sometime. But the way it's used in social media, I think is mostly bad envy and a mechanism to put other people down. It's like, here, look at us, we're having a good time and you're home watching TV. So I feel that our social networking now is more, I call it the currency of envy, is what drives our social media. So I learned how to look at situations and evaluate them in a more unbiased means. And that would be if I was now back in the competition of climbing the ladder, I would better understand, if I didn't get the position, I would better understand why I didn't get the position. It may be because somebody spoke Spanish and I didn't, but I could evaluate myself more critically and look at the situation, and instead of getting anger, I would get understanding and try and reconcile what my defects or why I didn't get it, and then try and improve myself. And so that the next time I tried to climb the rung, would be dictated more by my terms, not by the other side. The other thing I really learned, which I think is important for all societies, is it's not a disease, it's a term. It's called ACE, which is adverse childhood experiences. And I'm not sure you're aware with that. That was described maybe 20 years ago, but adverse childhood experience is in the 4 to 18-year-old group. Some say 14 to 18, 4 to 14, but I like to pretty much include the high school years. And it describes adverse events in your growing up. Those would be, if there's a divorce in the house, if there's a unwed pregnancy, if somebody's been incarcerated, any of the, there's mental problem. That was originally described with 10 events that in the house led to low self-esteem. It's now expanded. There's probably more than 20, but originally, if there were 10 and you had 3 of those events, then you had low self-esteem. And if you had low self-esteem, it was going to be very hard for you to succeed in society. And you were probably going to act out. You were full of the low self-esteem. Once again, is what drives the tall poppy syndrome on the cutter side. So it became very important to me to look at a huge segment in America. So we have a group that's called Deplorables by Hillary Clinton during her campaign. It's a swath of people in what we call the Rust Belt in America. And that's where a lot of our overdoses are, a lot of drug problems, a lot of overdoses, not intended. Some of them are intended, but most of them are probably not intentional. And so when you look at that white population that they describe, it's a huge portion of America. It's not just the Appalachians, which that area was, but I mean, it's across our country. And then we have our Black population, which is captured by a lot of those adverse childhood experiences, our Hispanic population. So in my own personal calculations, I think that segment makes up about 50% of our population. And that population now has low self-esteem, and they're going to be the cutters in the tall poppy syndrome. And when I look now during my daily scan of the news and I see an instance of that, then I have empathy for it and think, how can we control that? Not incarcerate them, not cut them down, do something bad to them, which is what happens. So I look at society very differently than I looked at it when I started, and have much more empathy towards my fellow man. In fact, in the chapter of my book on how to become a tall poppy, it's servitude. That I learned that the best way to become a tall poppy is to serve manhood. So I'm now very empathetic for people in my own small circle. I'm very, very conscious to try and help other people. The tall poppies don't need to be helped. They could be emulated so that I continue to grow. But I look at our society very differently than when I started my research. It's completely not what I expected. I didn't expect to find the tall poppy syndrome here. I didn't expect to understand a large swath of the population here. And I sort of knew, I lived in LA, so I knew the behavior of the Hollywood persona, which is so full of narcissistic people. And that led me to understand another bad envy emotion, which is Schadenfreude. I don't know if you know Schadenfreude, it's a German term. It means pain, joy. So Schadenfreude means that when somebody else fails, you get joy from it. And it's a very intoxicating emotion. So when somebody in Hollywood fails, I frequently have empathy for them, but society as a whole, they have nothing more than glee when somebody from Hollywood takes a tumble. And they frequently have all 3 of the cardinal sins: lust, greed, and pride, hubris. And people are very happy, but it's the tall poppy syndrome and cutting them down, which is elevating yourself, but you're gleeful about it, which also makes me sad. I hate to see people cut down even for the right reason, and I hate to see other people happy that they're cut down. So I also learned that about myself and about our society.
I mean, where would you say you are in regards to understanding the situation that you went through now on reflection? I mean, have you come to terms with it? Do you think, is it just the way
Well, I can, yeah, well, my own experience was I'd been there 30 years. And one thing I didn't mention, it was a county hospital, it was a government hospital. And the hierarchy within the government system, that's where the tall poppy syndrome is found most, is any hierarchy. The Catholic Church is a big hierarchy that the cardinal sins came from a pope to when he wrote his edict about it and named them, it was to control the monks. And so the hierarchy is a big cutter in the tall poppy syndrome and the government. And that's why it doesn't matter what government you're in, governments are hierarchy. And so by default, they're going to be one of the biggest cutters. So in the end, the hospital I was at was a government institution, but because I had a private practice, I wasn't in that institution. I was under contract, financial contract with them, which was not much, but it was still a contract, and I wasn't a volunteer, so to speak. But I didn't have the government regulations that everybody else had, which, for example, would be you have to have an annual chest x-ray, you have to have an annual TB test, you have to have your medical records, you know, all these things that institutions do to you. I didn't have those. So I never was within that system. So that in and of itself is a problem. Most of the staff, I think, rather enjoyed me because I wasn't making really money there. I was there for science and to help people. And most of my coworkers appreciated that, which was a way different thing than they looked at it. They looked at it as a job and their living, where I was looking, once again, for servitude, even though I didn't know it at the time, and to do research, which I enjoyed doing. So after 30 years, you know, people that I started with are also retiring and leaving and stuff. And you have a bunch of what I call young Turks. I call them not yets, NOTYET, kind of wannabes. And so it's like mob rule. So they're all going to get together and they're going to be friends and they're going to knock people off the top, and rightly so that they can move up. They can't move up if I'm up there because I've written more than they have. I have more power than they have. I have everything they don't have. So it's a natural thing for that to evolve. And I'm sure I would have gotten angry over it and dug in, and I'm sure I could have won it. I probably wouldn't have gotten my office back, but I could have probably so-called gotten even with the two people that were my Brutuses, so to speak, that actually took my office away. But my wife had emotional intelligence. She could see everything very clearly because she wasn't involved in the battle. So now I understand people better. I really understand emotions. I read a lot of books on emotions during my writing of the book. and I would just step back and say and evaluate the situation and say, what's important to me at this point in my life? Do I want to continue working here? Do I want to continue doing research here? Or do I want to start letting the parachute out and enjoying my life a little more and spending more time with my family? So I think always when we come to aha moments or moment where the road begins to diverge, I think uh, that's that's what you have to do. You have to always be in control, but you can't be driven by the negative aspect of your thinking or the emotions. You have to be driven by the positive aspects of those and still have control and make the right decision for you. And that meant, I mean, if that happened and I was um, only into the practice 10 years, I probably would have just joined, probably would have quit and just gone to another hospital. That's what you have to think about. This is mentioned because I'd been there 30 years. It was time for me to start slowing down. Research takes a lot of time. I mean, I never had that much time to myself and my family because I was either there, I was doing my private practice, being called, or if I was home, I was usually doing research. So my wife, maybe on her part, a little selfishly, decided it was time for her and me rather than me and me. And she was right, but I was fortunate to have her, and I made the right decision. As we were talking about earlier, it opened up in my own life, I think things happen for the best, even if it was negative at the time. For me, it opened up a brand new career. I mean, I probably read, I read 50 books one year, but I don't know how many books I read. There's no books on the tall poppy syndrome. There's a couple with the titles. If you go online, there are not any books on the tall poppy syndrome, which to me is a mind blower when I think it's one of the most prevalent things in our society. That people don't know about it, and there aren't any studies in America about it. The studies are mostly from Australia. There's a really good study in Canada on it. It's on women in the workplace, which is which I'll just go back to that point in a minute. But there wasn't anything. So in order for me to write the book, I don't know if I read, I'm sure I read more than 200 books, just trying to do emotional books. And I did a lot of how-to books, how to become a tall poppy. But I mean, most of them ended up to be dead ends, but I did a tremendous amount of reading. So it allowed me to take a new direction in life and to gain my 20s again, so to speak. I'm 78. I published this book at 77, so that's pretty good to really start over. And I have the next book in my head, and so it gave me a new leash on life, not a negative leash and be bitter that somebody moved my cheese. It was really a good thing to happen. I ended up having a better professional life, a better family life, and a new direction in my life. But one thing I think would be interesting for everybody, your viewers and listeners, when I was doing research and study, there's always, I mean, whether you're an artist or researcher, lifer of anything, there's always pivotal moments, your aha moments, or a piece of art where if you're looking at the scheme, you're drawing, and then there's there's a new drawing that comes along that's different. However it came out of your subconscious, it's different than what you've been doing, which is you're going off into a new direction. It's called a pivotal piece in art, but that was a pivotal piece in life for me. And so it's very important. I worked so hard, I didn't have time really to self-reflect. And so during all this reading time was mostly self-reflection time. And now I'm a much better person. As I mentioned, I'm a better servant to everybody, to my neighbors, to my church neighbors, to most people I'm in contact with. I don't have to compete now, but I'm more the person. We volunteer, just garden and do cleanup at one of our local neighborhoods here. So it helped me grow a lot. What I call actually professionally, even though I was in a profession, I feel now it's helped me grow more professionally. But one study that was very important to me. So there were pivotal studies, the 7 Deadly Sins, the emotions. There were some really important books. But one study really stuck out was in Australia, the researcher Flower, who's done most of the tall poppy syndrome research in Australia. He took high school elite athletes, and he took female athletes and male athletes, and they had the same questionnaire, which was bullying, which is similar to the tall poppy syndrome. Bullying's a little different in that there's usually a power difference. It's one of the main differences. Usually the bully's picking on somebody smaller than they are, for example. Usually it's repetitious. So there's some subtleties in it that are a little different. But anyway, he used it. He used bullying as the study. And the study found that every female high school athlete felt that they were bullied. And none of the men, the boys, felt they were bullied. And that was a real eye-opener to the insight of the woman and the man. And I then thought that, men kind of grow up bullying each other. I was bullied. My older brother was bullied. There was a lot of bullying where I grew up, and in my high school, there was really a lot of bullying. It was all boy high school. And the problem with that concept is that we think that we think that behavior is normal. And so when you look at our business field or the athletes, that behavior you learned back then continues on in your life. And you can read your how-to books on how to become somebody. But the thing that I liked about the tall poppy syndrome was the self-reflection it caused on you, which is what caused your improvement. If you were to read my book, for example, if you looked at the tall poppy syndrome, you would never guess that it's going to be a self-help book, as opposed to reading about somebody's memoir, somebody that's well known, for example. The problem in that is that most of them don't cause self-reflection. And people need to self-reflect and look at themselves and who they are. They want to be better, but they're not evaluating themselves. And what I found, as I mentioned, the hubris is a huge part of bullying. And you have to be able to look at yourself and understand who you are, which is the main reason you can really grow. And so I looked at that bad behavior, and actually a lot of the hubris that I found in the tall poppies that were tall poppied was there from growing up. And so I felt there was a strong correlation between a lot of tall poppies and bullying. And and they probably had done things, emulated other people that were strong bullying type personalities, and they continued that behavior. Makes them good CEOs sometimes, but in the end, they can be cut down. Now, on the other hand, the women, it's actually, there is a term called the reverse tall poppy syndrome, is that the women all feel that they were bullied. And so they, in their psyche, part of the thing then is that they don't want to be a tall poppy. They don't want to feel that pressure that they had from being cut down or being bullied in high school. And so they underachieve and they stay equal, but they don't want to get into the workforce and crawl up the workforce for fear of being cut down. And so that was a really formative piece of research I found, and also then how I evaluated, once again, how I look at a tall poppy syndrome, and when I look at people and their emotions, and also the genders on how we look at things so differently. So now I'm also much better at doing that as well. So almost everything eventually that I read sooner or later came back to help me in writing the book.
What, I mean, you're talking about, you know, some people, whether it's bullying or whatever, for some people, that's the spark that sets them off. That's the spark that actually pushes them on. They are, you know, it's almost like a reverse drive. The more you put me down, the more I will stand up, the more I will be the tall poppy. Whereas other people, you might say, the more you put me down, the longer I'll stay down, right? So it's
Yes, yes.
Here's, do you have a view on why we react differently?
Well, I think that's once again your emotional makeup, and I was kind of, it's the anger. You're getting close to the anger emotion, which is, so I'll just tell you the good anger emotion. So let's you don't play basketball so much as we do here, but it's basketball season, and say somebody drives around you, and so that makes you angry. They score a layup or something, and so in order to improve yourself, you've got to work a little harder, work on your footwork or something in order to get a little speedier, to be able to improve yourself, be a better guard. The bad anger then would be, if he's going to do that again, I'm going to elbow him or I'm going to trip him. So in your bullying, you've just described those, once again, that the positive and negative effects. So the good anger, what you're talking about, is I'm not going to let that person knock me down. I mean, I don't care how many hits he does, that this is going to make me stronger and I'm going to come back. So that's the strong part of the emotional makeup. That's kind of what I'm hoping people understand from our discussion, versus the other group, which would take in the laziness. They don't want to do the work. It's too easy to be passive, and I'm not going to put myself in this situation. So that's kind of the negative aspect of that. And you know, you can work hard on anything, take you 10 years to get your name, and proof you do something dumb, and you can lose all that hard work overnight. So, I mean, that's what drives politics. So there's very few politicians that work hard and gain that do-good aspect. Most of it is spent tearing down other people. I mean, that's what drives politics and makes it, I don't know, where good people don't want to do it or good people don't want to be part of it, because it's mostly a negative part of their life rather than a positive part. So, but that's the positive and negative of the emotions that I'm talking about, and trying to have people understand it, which is, I think, what you just asked, that the bullying and the big bully puts you down. And I think it had impacts on me. I mean, I'm like you. I wanted to work harder. I wanted to do better whenever it happened to me. But I can tell you that that's not been my experience. Of most people that get bullied, they stay down, which I think, that's our whole negativity seems to win over positivity. So I'm trying to show how good positivity can be, I guess, and flip the switch from negativity to becoming more positive, and to look at situations and evaluating them better and put them in a positive light.
How much would you say is, with the tall poppy, is it subconscious? It's what I'm hearing is it's sort of ego led, and it's, it is predominantly subconscious, or, or do we do it consciously, do you think?
Well, I think the peer-to-peer, I think is more conscious, because it's using the, I mean, I think Feather's right that it's using it's looking at somebody and just thinking you're not going to be able to do that. So that becomes a habit too. I mean, you are your habits, right? So, and they happen, that's why they happen, just like the study of the men and women in bullying. I mean, if you are in that environment young, and you develop bad envy, I think, unless you were to read my book, no, I'm teasing, unless you really have somebody, I mean, most people don't even appreciate good and bad, the difference between good and bad envy. So how are they going to change their behavior if they don't understand the difference? And evaluate, they're going to be biased in how they look at the world. And so they're going to look at the world through their eyes, and they're going to see their same behavior, and that's what they're going to relate to. So it's very difficult to break that pattern. And so, it's harder to get an A than it is a C. And it's harder to, the closer you get to it, it's harder to reach the very top. So I don't think women, as we talk, sometimes want to underachieve, but there's a lot of men do that just as well. So it's, I just won't achieve high. It's too much work. I'm going to get cheated out. That guy's smarter. He works harder. You get this negativity in your head. You talk yourself into not doing it, and maybe subconsciously then cutting him down. So yeah, I think the subconscious is probably 90% of it. That's why I differentiated between the direct and the indirect. I think the indirect is mostly subconscious. When I gave my thing about the car, the direct is the active, the scratching of the car, punching a tire, doing something actively negative, versus the passive negative. And I think the passive component of it, I think a lot of it is subconscious.
You mentioned purpose earlier on, and really, I suppose, also what you were saying, what you're doing now. I mean, it's almost more purposeful. I mean, are you clear in your life purpose now? Do you know what you were brought here to do?
I think so. I mean, I think in the end, I sort of knew. I went into medicine, which is, sort of helping people. So once that was all subconscious, it wasn't actually subconscious. I never even thought about being a doctor. I was a dorm advisor. I was at a Jesuit college. I was a dorm advisor, and it was a Jesuit school. And the Jesuit who was the overseer of that particular dorm, one day, I'd been in that dorm my freshman year, and then at the end of my freshman year, he asked me to come back and be a dorm advisor. to stay in the dorm, but then it'd be the freshman, I'd be a sophomore and helping them or whatever. And then into my first semester, my sophomore year, he asked me if I ever thought about becoming a physician. And my answer was no, I never thought about it. And I actually, even that changed. The good thing at that particular time for me was I now was focused. I didn't have any focus my first year. I just gone to college like a lot of people go to college just to try and get ahead or to do what you think you have to do. But I really had no focus in who I was, who I wanted to be, or what I wanted to do. But his thoughts on it changed how I viewed everything, and I then had focus, and I went from an average student to being on the dean's list and getting into medical school in 3 years, and then going through medical school. But the whole problem with that whole process is that you work hard to get into med school, you work hard in medical school, you work hard in your residency, you start to practice, you work hard to build your practice. So you really, even though you can kind of think you're serving people and stuff, it's not like that at all. You're just working. It's a job. I mean, to say I did 500 total knee replacements. Well, when you start, that's a complex operation and it's a big deal. But after you do a few of that, it's like making a milkshake sort of in the end. So it's just as boring as anything else as far as I'm concerned. But I also was fortunate. I went to Vietnam. I was on the DMZ as a MASH surgeon. And then I have to tell you, then I knew what being a doctor was. And that was more of wasn't a Rubicon moment of me making a life decision and changing everything. But I was this little kid and who hadn't been anywhere from central Iowa, who all of a sudden was on the DMZ fighting, or not fighting, but taking care of wounded. I mean, they just come in waves on the medevac choppers. And so at that 1 year period in my life, I call it, I became a man. So I learned then really how to take care of people and what it was to be a physician, because there was hardly a day go by that I didn't save a life. So I was lucky also, as you and I discussed earlier. I think my life was just lucky. I was lucky to learn what it really meant to be a physician. And so, I mean, I think it reflected by the type of practice that I had and being in a rehabilitation hospital. But after all the research and the time that I've spent thinking about everything, if I did it over, I would be a very different physician than I am today, because of all the research that I put into the book, and to thinking about life and what's it mean, and who am I and how do I fit into it. I mean, I'm really different now than I was then. So I think, in order to write a book, first thing you have to do is read a lot. And I think that's one of the things in life. I mean, when I look at you, I hope those are all books back there, and not music. But I mean, in order to appreciate life, I think you have to read a lot. Unfortunately, I read a lot, but it was mostly research for my next article that I was doing. But I still think you learn most by research and reading. And, I learned a lot about myself and a lot about my life during this 5 to 10 year period that I worked on this book. And, I had no, in the end, I think it's a big self-help book, or it's an eye-opener, and I had no intention. I was trying to answer the question of why isn't it the tall poppy syndrome in America? And that that had nothing to do with the whole thing by the time I was done with it. And I would love somebody in Australia to read the book and see my take on them, because I'm sure they would say, well, that in fact, the first time, and I actually published this, but we had an orthopedic surgeon who was very, very prominent, but he didn't start out prominent. He was an arthroscopist, or arthroscopy, say, of the knee, which people think about looking at the knee. When I started, we had to open the knee up and look inside of it. And then arthroscopy, we could just make this little nick and put a scope in there and look. He was one of the first orthopedic surgeons to do that and develop a lot of techniques. And of course, he was tall poppied his whole career. I mean, the hospital, the other orthopedists didn't want him on call or want him on that hospital, because he would take all the patients. He couldn't get into the local medical society. He couldn't get into the sports society, which at that time was still kind of the older guys who had the big names, all the heroes of the sports field at that time. But with time, he eventually got into that, and then he was asked back at the end of his career to do the highlights of his career. Well, when I read his history, I sent him a note that you've been tall poppy, and I'd like to use you and write this up and put it in our orthopedic literature of what happens to tall poppies in our orthopedic society. And of course, he didn't know what it was, so I had to explain everything to him. And he goes, "No, I don't want any part of this because I don't believe it." So it's like, well, okay. So anyway, his summary was printed in one of our journals, as they do sometimes, to have inspiration to other orthopedic surgeons. And so once it was in the literature, then, it becomes available to everybody. So then I just used his case report and did an article on the tall poppy syndrome in orthopedic surgery and published it. So it was the first kind of time in medicine that the tall poppy syndrome made it in the medical literature. Mostly it ends up in the psychosocial literature, but almost all the studies in Australia were from that, not from the true so-called medical literature, the MD literature, the PhD literature. So I put that in our literature, and then I put a few more in the scientific literature too, which if any of your listeners want to go to my website, douggarland.com. So on the right-hand side, there will be scientific articles. There will be M, which is Medium, which is Google's blog site, which I have blogs. And there will be Twitter. There's about 2,000 tweets on the Twitter account. Usually I do 1 to 3 Twitters a day. I still read the newspapers every day and look for the tall poppy syndrome. And if I see it, I just retweet the article and put why it's an example of the tall poppy syndrome. So you can get an idea of where my head is, which once again is very different from what's out there in the literature and what's in other countries. But it's pretty fascinating. I think everybody, I mean, somebody said, well, do you think, who's always the thing when you're writing a book, if you talk to anybody, it's like, who's your audience? That's the first thing first thing is why do you want to write a book, I think, first. But second thing is, who's your audience? And then I say everyone that's an adult, and they goes, well, that's never going to sell anything. And they're probably right, because you have to have uh, specific audience to direct your focus. And this is a very unfocused book, but in the end, I think everybody would be better off if they read it. It's very insightful and makes one ask a lot of questions. And I think if there are more questions asked than answered, then you've done a good job. And there's also a few negative responses I've had, which was be like my friend who said that's not my take on it. But the other thing with that is sometimes if the flak is getting a little close, you're getting close to the enemy or hitting home. So that's another thing that I learned, that I can take the flak now, because if somebody's unhappy with me, I can not have that negative fight and put up my fists and want to duke it out with them. I can think, I must be doing well here. I'll just quit while I'm ahead.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Sometimes you gotta stick to your morals, right? Or you gotta sort of stick to your core message, and not everyone's gonna get it. And that's okay too, especially in the likes of this, where I'm guessing there's a lot of ego. You're going to get a lot of, that's the point of the tall poppy. It's, you're different to me. You are achieving something I'm not there for. We have this difference. Therefore, I will reduce you in size or whatever, right? So egotistically, yeah, we're always going to do that, because your truth is not mine, and therefore I will try and set you free of your mistakes, or your perceived mistakes, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's like the guy telling me I wasn't a tall poppy. So that was a huge, I think I didn't write or think about it for 6 weeks. I was so devastated. It's like, well, where am I going to go from here? So that was one of the first things I had to reconcile was who is the tall poppy? And in the end, we're all tall poppies. We all are just what you're describing, and we have to deal with that. And it is part of our own ego and our own makeup and stuff. But that's why I think the peer-to-peer is so relevant. It's because we're all human beings, and we're all the same. That's why, I mean, that's why in the end it's a book for everybody, because it is about everybody and everybody's emotions. The emotional part in the present book is not so great, because it hasn't evolved to the extent of where it is in my head right now, but it's there. It's just kind of between the lines.
I mean, what's your overall thoughts with, somebody finding themselves in a tall poppy situation now? I mean, do you lean in and celebrate your difference, celebrate your drive, celebrate whatever, or do you become less poppy? Do you tone it down? Do you change angle? Do you try and meld into the environment a bit better?
No, I think, well, for me personally, I think tall poppies are one of the most important things in life. You can't have society advance without tall poppies. So my original premise was that America worshiped the individual in the tall poppy, and I still think that's probably true here more than other countries. But the thing is that understanding the syndrome and the ability to look at the cutter and try and understand their reasoning, understand the behavior of the cuttee and their behavior, and then your own bias. So really, when I look at it, you're looking at three different things. And one, as I mentioned about the ACE, the adverse childhood experiences, I'm very less condemning of the low esteem cutter that's prevalent in the peer-to-peer, because I look at them in a very different light, and I'm very careful not to kind of pick on them because probably their circumstances weren't so good. So I'm more anxious to give them a break. And then the tall poppy, it depends on if it was hubris. As just mentioned, Hollywood kind of bugs me with their hubris and narcissism. So I probably wouldn't cut them a break. But I think you have to, still evaluate those circumstances of each of those two people, but you still have to really look at yourself and say, am I evaluating this correctly? I mean, I don't know if you allegedly heard about the slap heard around the world. I mean, so you have Chris Rock, you have Will Smith, and you have yourself. So, that's why there's a big take on anything. But for example, I won't give you my take, but for example, Will Smith probably had some pride and he had anger, and that drove him to slap or kind of tall poppy Chris Rock. And then to a certain extent, Will Smith has cut himself down by those bad parts of those emotions. So he was trying to cut somebody else down. He cut himself down. But you're going to want to pick sides. So you have to be careful of, who's right. And so that's kind of how you have to look at life and reflect on yourself. And if you have to be like my wife, be very emotionally intelligent, stay detached from the situation, and just not get involved if you don't know anything what you're doing. But once we can, now that we're on a specific, I'll give you another specific to think about, would be our present world war going on between Putin and Ukraine. So really, you've got a nation trying to tall poppy another nation, and a government misbehaving again, like the original description. You've got Putin, who's a very prideful man, and they're trying to take down this country. And Zelensky actually has become a tall poppy. Shakespeare said, some people are born great and some people have greatness thrust upon them, and that's going to be who Zelensky was. But he's become a tall poppy. But so here I am as the viewer, and I'm thinking, well, this is just very wrong. But the problem with all that is it's all in the viewer's bias, and evidently maybe half of the world doesn't think that's wrong. So that's in it in a nutshell. So there's no right or wrong, and your own bias is well developed, and you have to really think about things. But for me, that's a clear-cut example of the tall poppy syndrome, and there's a right and a wrong. But when you look in the big scheme of life and the world we live in, some people don't arrive at the same conclusion. So that tells you a lot of things, and the most important one is my tall poppy is not your tall poppy.
Where's your poppy now?
My tall poppy is probably the pastor at my church. So I go every Sunday. Actually, I have two tall poppies, two very important tall poppies in my life right now. I have um, the head pastor at the church, and then I go to a Bible class as well during the week. And the gentleman that holds the Bible class is my other tall poppy. Those are my two main tall poppies at the present time. I have 4 grandkids. They're my tall poppies, but my personal tall poppies are those two people. I mean, as I mentioned, I think tall poppies are important because of inspiration. So I look forward to those 2 meetings every week to really get the inspiration, which when we talk about why we have books and heroes and stuff, that when I was actually trying to write a section which was about a third of the book on how to become a tall poppy. And when I looked through, I mean, there's like 10,000 self-help books every year that's published. I mean, it's just a huge market. But I mean, I'm taking into account cookbooks and everything like that. But anyway, the literature, I mean, was just overwhelming, and I was overwhelmed by what I should try and read and who I should follow and who were tall poppies. And I decided that I couldn't answer that question on how to become a tall poppy, because it 2 things happened. One is I just couldn't do it. 2 is that I felt the so-called inspirational books actually were failing because there was nobody being transformed and nobody becoming a tall poppy. If that was all happening, next year there wouldn't be 10,000 books, there'd only be 5,000 books. And the following year there'd be 2,500 books. So I thought there was a lot of inspiration, but not a lot of transformation. And I thought I couldn't do better by not focusing on that and focusing on the negative, what I call the negative part of the book, which is actually how many people look at it. I mean, the subtitle is The Joy of Cutting Others Down, which is very negative. But I came from medicine, and my background, obviously, in the background of medicine is you don't learn anything from good health. We learn mostly from bad health. We learn from sickness. So it reinforced that understanding the negative aspect of the emotions. If I could get other people to understand those, then I thought maybe if they got it, they would be able to switch over to the positive side or the virtue. And the final thing that happened, Tolstoy and Anna Karenina, there's a line in there that all happy families are the same. So you don't learn much from seeing a happy family, if really it's kind of true. But all unhappy families are unhappy for different reasons. And so there's always more to learn, I think, from negative than positive. So you just have to figure that aspect out too. I kind of knew it, but once again, just what we talked about, subconsciously, it wasn't as apparent to me as when I gave up on the positive aspect and felt I could do more if I showed people the tall poppy syndrome and the bad behavior, either on the cutter's part, on the tall poppy's part, or perhaps on the viewer's part. So if you once again, the bully is growing up being a bully. He doesn't appreciate, my father was kind of a bully. I'm not sure he he was in World War II, and the military and the order of the military, and that's what they used when I was growing up, still a little bit, when we still had the draft and I was drafted. And in our little small town, if we had a bully, they used to say, wait till the Army or the Navy gets a hold of him, you know. So my father grew up with that and with the Army, and I think he liked the discipline and the order, and so he thought that was good, and that's kind of the way he raised us. Which the military, if you were ever in the military is first hierarchical, which is very bad news, but it's pretty much about bullying the entire time, especially the enlisted men. So that was him, and I don't think he ever realized he was a bully. So, that was just ingrained from him probably in childhood. And he was in his father's business. They were in the grain business, so there was a certain amount of bullying. Even he never did. Even when my grandfather retired, he stayed out of the daily business, but he still came into the office, so my father was still never rid of him. And so he never had that freedom and always had that kind of bullying hanging over his head. So bullying was a big part of his life, and I think he did it to us. And it would have taken one of his 6 boys to become very strong and tell him, your behavior is very bad. But that's maybe one of the reasons we didn't want to go into the family business. 6 boys and none of us wanted the business. We all left. And when we did that, he retired. But we would have had to been strong enough, so to speak, to kind of put him in his place. Because he's not going to read a self-help book, and he's never going to self-reflect. So that's a problem, I think, with both men and women, but we're on bullying, so I think that's a bigger part of manhood than it is womanhood. But both sexes are good at denial.
As you were talking about Viktor Frankl's, in the Man's Search for Meaning earlier, it's that sort of belief that actually we're all, our truth is the right truth. That we're doing the right thing, and that sometimes that form of bullying is like, well, I'm doing what's right for you. I'm doing the best thing for you. You maybe just don't know it yet, and you're kind of going, no, that's not a good thing. It's like, yes, it is. This is how you learn. And like, actually, no, that's old and outdated thinking, right? But when you're in that hamster wheel, you're just going, that's it. You're just ignorant to it, and you don't know any better.
Yeah, you're right. That's in the fight or in the hamster wheel. That's what I said. Even medicine, you're really in the hamster wheel. You're not thinking. I think it depends who you read now, but physician burnout is 60 to 70%. So there's something very, very wrong with that picture. And my own personal take on it is, they need to take time and do some reading and reflect on how lucky all of them are to be physicians and an opportunity to really help people. But I personally have a hard time relating to all that. But my path was very, very different than the path they're on right now. So I'm not going to be judgmental, but something's definitely wrong there when physicians aren't happy with the profession they're in.
Yeah, and it's probably there's plenty of professions where people aren't happy, but I think there's big shifts ahead. I think, I don't know, life is changing.
Well, COVID did that. I think it gave as I said, I had the pause to go into the military, which, once again, in the end, everybody, to include myself, I thought the world when I ended up in Vietnam by myself. The whole thing with as a physician, you're not attached to a unit. So at least you go in with a buddy or you make friends and you're kind of in this together. But as an individual physician, just, being assigned to a place, you're all by yourself. And then, of course, when I got my assignment, I never heard of where it was. And I go, "Where is it?" He goes, "Look at the top of the map." And I thought, well, the world just swallowed me up. So, but in the end, so, you think that what worse could be that, but in the end, it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. So you never know, but that's what I think about COVID. It gave people here a 2-year time off that they weren't in the hamster wheel. They're more at home thinking about themselves and who they were and what they wanted to do. And some of them made some changes. So in the end, COVID, I think, may have helped some people and may have helped businesses look at their health a little differently. And maybe for me personally, I mean, that's what I call servitude. Your boss really, leadership is really just making sure the people under you have all the right things to do their job rightly. That's what I call leadership. So I think some of the leaders now are appreciating their help a little more and want to help them get back inside and get to work now. So I think it was some learning on both sides of the fence.
There's a book, as you speak, there's a book, Black Box Thinking by Matthew Said. And I find it fascinating how, just as you were sort of saying, in the healthcare field and hospitals and that almost sort of want to hide the statistics, the deaths, the problems, the issues, whereas when you compare it to the aviation industry, whereas they, not that they celebrate instances, but there's almost there's an embargo on any sort of penalty when people bring forward situations. So actually they encourage this inquisitive nature. They encourage the investigation process. And I find that interesting that, people sort of deem that being up in an airplane is more deadly than being in a hospital. But the point being is the ethos of learning is different. And I find that very fascinating.
Yes, it is. I mean, I agree with you how one is celebrated and not celebrated, but you go over with a fine-tooth comb and the other's swept under the table. A death or a complication. I mean, if you want to talk denial, it's having a complication, and so your associate brings it, "Come look at this knee for me," and he says, "I think it's just having a little stitch reaction or something." So he's in complete denial, once again, that he's going to have a negative outcome. It's not just doctors, it's everybody, but if a life is concerned, it's a little more threatening sometimes. And you come in, it's just like, "Geez, that's an infected knee. You got to take it back and wash it out." And then they start arguing. And it's, "No, it's not. Yes, it is, And you got that negative bias, and you're never going to be able to admit to yourself that you failed. So it's really a hard nut to crack. And I was on the administrative side most of my life, not in my private practice, but in my academic practice. And it's very hard to combat any accident in that profession, because there's just so much writing on it, and there's just such denial. It's just the failure of it. It's just such a personal thing, I guess it's like a divorce even. It's just very, very personal.
For you, is there been a correlation between the tall poppy and seniority, years of experience, or age? I mean, is there a connection, do you think, between the two? There, sort of the young dog versus the old dog, the junior versus the senior. Is that always an interface or a sort of a flashpoint?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because do you know the Peter Principle, which is a huge thing in America? The Peter Principle is you rise to your level of competence and then incompetence, and then of course you can't go any higher. So Dr. Peter was a PhD psychologist at USC, where I also was. And he retired about the year I started. And his book was not only a bestseller, that his research was the hierarchy in work, just what you're talking about. And he actually called the tall poppy syndrome hierarchical exfoliation, just what you described. So, and that's actually to a certain extent what happened to me. It was the Young Turks in the end happy. I'm sure there was a lot of schadenfreude when I put my key on the desk and walked out. But he actually described the whole hierarchy and had all these terms for it. But he described 50 years ago what you're talking about. And since he was from USC and I knew all his stuff, I reread his book just like Viktor Frankl. So talking about reading, I went back I read Jack Kennedy's book on, he won the Pulitzer Prize. About that time too, but anyway, that was regarding tall poppies. And I thought, well, because our social media companies have such a strong influence in our society here, and they're the upstarts, and how they do business and how they claim they do business is different than 99% of the other businesses in America, which is what you're talking about: working from home, diversity, open offices, no office cubicles, and everybody's the same. And so when I looked at everything, I actually thought they were worse than the rest of society, because once again of the meritocracy and the backbiting and the ability to try and beat everybody else, which is they're very aggressive people to start with. So if you have aggression, there's going to be more tall poppy syndrome. So I felt in just looking at articles about them that in the end they actually had more tall poppy syndrome than our public part. But the face of them was like, everything's happy here. But underneath that mask, I felt things were worse than everything else. Emotions are very hard to change. And even if you and I talk about it and want it to be what I think they should be, as soon as your listeners leave, they're going to close the door and go back, and it's going to be business as usual. And we're in this dogfight and I got to survive. And so, the .com people had that saying, only the paranoid survive, was from Dr. Moore. And I think that's true in that profession. And if they believe that, which they do, trust me, there's going to be a lot of tall poppy syndrome there. And the top dog, the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs, those people are going to be hard for the young Turks to cut them down and move ahead of them. So there's some things that change, but in the end, I don't think they're really too different than the old-fashioned GE or Ford Motor Company that's been around 100 years and had that well established. I mean, there's a true disruptor, which is very different, which would be Elon Musk, and starting that company from scratch and becoming successful, and a different model. And that is very different probably than all traditional motor companies out there, whether it's Japan or France or America. In the end, most of those companies are very similar, and Elon's different. I mean, he didn't have a distributorship and he could change everything online and this and that, but that's more of a disruptor. That's pretty uncommon. And probably you know what, in about 10 or 25 years, he's going to be just, most likely that corporation will be just like the rest.
Yeah. It's interesting because I mean, some people would say Elon Musk's style it's a very bullying management style, that, he's almost so driven by the point and the purpose that actually he knows a better way, but the only way he can get results is by, sort of enforcing, he has such a clarity of vision. So I don't know, it's interesting, right? There's no doubt is phenomenal, but also it's possibly his methods as well are not good for everyone, maybe.
Well, I mean, when I looked, that was the problem with all of them: Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, the group at Google, Zuckerberg. I mean, you're right. I mean, those types. Well, if you look at all our robber barons in America in the 1800s, the Standard Oil, well, Ford and Edison, all those people in there, they were, once again, I'm just telling you, things don't change. Those people are the same no matter what period and what place. And in America, enterprises, most of those personalities are the same. So if you put Musk at Google, he'd be the same as he is at this place, which is very driven and to a certain extent, a lot of bullying. So yeah, that's not going to change. That's the tall poppy syndrome helps you appreciate and separate that stuff. I can tell you another interesting thing I learned, I forget what Napoleon had he has a roll of statues of inspirational people. And he had both Julius Caesar and Brutus. So there's a message there too, that he had the tall poppy, and he also had the guy you were talking about that cut the tall poppy down. And of course, sadly, Brutus cut himself down. So he didn't stay tall very, very long. Literally and figuratively, he did.
Tell me, if you were then to try and describe your fire in your belly in one or two words, Doug, what would they be?
To describe what?
Your fire in your belly. What is it?
Well, now, just personal growth, self-improvement. I think I work hard every day. I'm retired, but this being retired for me is I don't have a true boss, even though I was always my own boss. Medicine was really my boss, and my patients don't think of it. They really were the boss of me. So I'm my own boss now, but I read a lot, I think a lot. I'm much more generous to people than I ever was, and I still have aspiring leaders, and I don't want to change the world, but I still think I have a lot to add to the world. So as I mentioned, I have my next book was written in my head. It's always harder to get it out of your head on your paper, but my bucket list is, I have no bucket list. My bucket list is, I'm happy with myself. I'm happy where I live, and I don't aspire to take time off from what I'm doing now and visit the world and do things. I'm happy to be here and helping myself, which in my small way, I think helps society.
Well, do you know what? If we all did that, the world would be a very different place, right?
I think so.
So tell us, where can people learn more about you, get a copy of the book, hunt you down, track you down?
Can you see the book?
I can see the book indeed.
It's a lovely cover. It's the Tall Poppy Syndrome, The Joy of Cutting Others Down. It's available on Amazon. Also, I mentioned my website, Doug Garland, DOUGGARLAND.com. The book, you can hit that and find a lot about the book on my website. And it'll chase you to where you can purchase it. And just the website really, I think there's some interesting, I think my take on the scientific articles, I think, are worthy to read for anybody. They're just, they're not hard science like real scientific articles. They're just case reports and things, but they're very insightful on how I look at life and physicians and physicians' roles. I mean, there's some international competition, and discoveries in AIDS, HIV. We had France and America had a fight over who discovered the AIDS virus. So there's a lot of competition in everything, not just medicine, even between countries, let alone people. So I point that out in, I think, 2 or 3 of the articles are about international tall poppy between physicians. There's an article on the first anti-vax movement, or what started the anti-vax movement. Those are all on the scientific articles. The blogs are very, very good. I don't do them now because I spend a lot more time thinking and reading and writing, but I started out writing blogs, and they were good enough that Google assigned me to be a writer for them, which means they everything that I write, Google looks at and will kind of disperse it. It doesn't stay on my blog only. And the Twitters, I think, are the most interesting because my thoughts are always changing, and so you can actually see my thoughts changing from the first one I wrote to the last one I wrote. The problem with it is, some of the articles you can look at, but as you know, some articles, like if you're not a subscriber to the Wall Street Journal, you're not going to be able to click on that. Sometimes they let you do it. It depends. It depends on different things, but some of the articles you can actually click on, and some of them are very interesting. I did Jimmy Stewart, our actor. Something came up about what happened 50 years ago, and I don't know if he died then or something, but there was an obituary about Jimmy Stewart that I saw, and it was really about how to be a tall poppy. So I tweeted that just under the hashtag tall poppy, not tall poppy syndrome, which is usually my hashtag. And that got a lot of hits. I mean, there was just, people forgot, but it was such a endearing story, and somebody in his aspirations and doing well and sharing love. And it was just wonderful, and it had a lot of hits. So you get that this kind of an inspiring piece of work now and then. I hit the nail on the head. So that one's fun. But I don't do the other social media. As you may have gathered, I think it's an envy machine, and I don't like to be part of that. So that's it. I don't do Facebook or any of the others.
Well, do you know what? I mean, yeah, I think you find your platform and you stick to that. I think otherwise there's a lot of people say you need to be omnipresent, but I'm not sure that we do.
Well, I think, for me, as I say, philosophically, I have some problem with it. And for me, it's just going to, I'm afraid, I think, be more distraction. There's a thing, the internet gives you the ability to see knowledge, and it doesn't give you the ability to have wisdom, I don't think. So it's kind of like me with the problem I had with inspirational books are they're not inspirational enough to make you transform. So that's kind of my problem with a lot of the internet. I consider it, for me personally, to be a huge distraction. I would still rather have the book. As I mentioned, I'm big on reading. I mean, I had to do so much background reading to even do a scientific article and stuff. There, you know, in order to write about it, you've got to really know a lot about it. And so I find my time is much better spent just alone and reading rather than doing a lot of stuff on the internet. That's just personal. Somebody else is going to say the opposite, but for me, that works the best. So I don't do a lot of the other stuff.
Absolutely. So tell us, is there a final point you'd like to leave with our listeners, something to get them thinking about?
Oh yeah, there is one thing. I have this pet peeve. You know, everybody has pet peeves. I have pet peeves between jealousy and envy. Actually, there's two things I want to talk about. Envy, I mentioned, is coveting pretty much somebody's other things. They have something that you don't have. That's envy. And the good component we talked ad lib is emulating and improving yourself to be able to achieve that, whereas bad envy, cutting it down. Jealousy is you have something and you're losing it. And there's usually three people involved. So you're losing that something to the third person. Though there's envy often involved within the jealous situation, but people interchange those. And if you're interchanging them, you're changing the complete context of the situation, and you don't understand it. And if you don't understand the difference between those two emotions, you're not going to understand what you're reading or seeing. So that's why there's so much emotional confusion, and people in movements and doing things are things are out of context or they don't understand them. So it's very important emotionally. There aren't that many big time emotions, and most people should understand the huge difference between the two, which leads me into the final thing I wanted to say is the Bible is full of emotions. If you read the Bible, for me, it's one big tall poppy syndrome. So if you start out Adam and Eve, they were tall poppied by God. Moses was eventually tall poppied by God. He didn't let him, he led the people out of slavery, but Moses didn't get to go into England. Of course, Cain and Abel is familial envy. So you can go through the entire Bible and see the tall poppy syndrome. And why I think that's, I wanted to mention that is because that gives you, first, the Bible often confuses jealousy and envy, which is not mind-blowing, but I understand that. But if you get that right, the context to it becomes better and more important. But the Bible actually becomes more fun. It's like simply done in the Bible or something. It makes the Bible much more readable and easier to understand. And because the Bible is very emotional, and if you have your emotional intelligence, for example, I actually struggled way back with gods in Greece and in Rome having Romans having emotions and stuff, and I struggle with how can the gods have emotions. And so in reading the Bible, I also struggled with God cutting people down and stuff. So if you kind of get the tall poppy syndrome a little bit, the Bible becomes a much more interesting book to read. There's a lot of answers in the Bible. All your answers are really in the Bible. In the end, for the most part, everything you read in the Bible will speak to you. It's like Shakespeare, why is he great? Well, if you happen to be white or black or gray or green, he's going to speak to you. If you're gay or straight or whatever, however you read Shakespeare, he just has that ability to speak to human nature. And in the Bible, I think emotionally does the same on many levels. So the tall poppy syndrome has a lot of applications. I guess that was my message.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you get to the Bible, it's, you can read and interpret the way you want to, right? But that's perspective, that's life. It's one person's perspective is another person's truth, or, whatever. So, no, it's very interesting. Doug, it's been wonderful chatting to you. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for sharing that. And listen, I wish you all the best. And obviously, you've got your future book coming up as well. I think that's going to be fantastic. So it's obviously there and ready to create. So well done. And yeah, listen, thank you again for sharing. And until the next time, thank you.
All right. It's been my pleasure. Nice meeting you.
And you.